Okay, so we are now halfway through it, and the sun has just come through the window here in Melbourne, Australia. Hi, my name is Nik Ranger. We're here for 5 hours of technical SEO, and welcome with me because, like, I literally feel like I have the best job in the world. I get to chat to extremely smart people, learn, and be able to ask all the questions that I want. And to be honest, like, we are absolutely blessed today with I'm going to try and say your name, and I tried to say your name correctly in the promo, so sorry. Bartosz Góralewicz. Oh my gosh.
Close enough. I'll give you a pass for that. You did well.
That's kind of the best I can hope for sometimes. So thank you. And of course, Will Critchlow and Cindy Krum. Awesome. So how are you guys this morning?
It's like almost 10 p.m. in here, but I guess we're all like, I think everyone is in a different time zone, but yeah, it's good. I loved the previous sessions. I can't wait for hours. And I wanted to say a quick thank you to both Cindy and Will, and obviously you, Nik, for helping me out throughout this obviously the best session. The whole
clearly,
yeah.
We're very excited to hear what you have to say, Bart.
No pressure, right?
Okay, absolutely.
So should we get started? Like,
let's get cracking into it.
Okay, so now comes the awkward part. I'm gonna try to share my presentation. It's always a bit tricky. But
while you're doing that, I'm just going to remind everybody, as we're at the halfway point, if you've just tuned in now, I'm going to do like a little blog for Semrush. Hit that subscribe button, smash that like button, and click on the notification bell to be able to see all the new videos that will be populating in the feed, to see all the newest, latest things from your favorite SEOs around the world.
It might just be working. Okay, so I don't want to jinx it. I had PowerPoint crash on me recently. I hope it's not going to happen tonight. Anyhow, thanks everyone, and let's just get to it. So today I want to go over some like real problems behind indexing, something that we found out through our work with clients. And before I move into, my name is Bartosz Góralewicz. I'm a CEO of Onely. We're deeply specialized in technical SEO, but recently we're focusing quite a bit on both rendering SEO and indexing issues. And this is what we're going to go over today. And the link to this deck is going to be on the last slide, so no need to take notes, obviously, if something is on a slide. And let's move forward. So I want to start with a personal story. So when I got invited to speak here tonight, or this morning, I started to prepare a little bit. And we've been researching indexing for a while now. And the truth be told, it gets quite boring sometimes, because we, like, behind the scenes, probably Will can relate to that a tiny bit. It's all about proxies, then Google going after us and banning our proxies because we're scraping Google, then scraping sitemaps of our clients, and then Google, those websites will ban our proxies because, again, we're scraping their sitemaps, more proxies, and so on. So this is a fairly boring task if you look at that. And lockdown in my house throughout COVID, my mind started to play tricks on me. And at some point, I really felt like Google is starting to challenge me a bit, because it started easy with those captchas with like boats, something that we all know. Then they wanted hills and mountains, even though I couldn't find any. And then I was like, just like, what the fuck is this? So after a lot of thinking and a quick doubt, if maybe I became a robot here, locked down in my house, I understood why we as an SEO community do that one thing. I felt a very strong urge to do something that we all hate as a community, a correlation study. I know we all can relate to one thing that we all hate, correlation study, because we all know that if it correlates, it's true. So I wanted to see what's going to correlate with indexing. So I called Tomek, our head of research development, and he said, like, we have 1 million URLs in our database. Something has to correlate with these. So I was like, amazing. This is what I'm going to talk about at 5 hours of technical SEO, because this is going to be clearly amazing content. And the result was like 160 columns filled with data. And we were praying that one of these columns will correlate with is indexed. Long story short, results were underwhelming. It turns out that no clear metric would correlate with our whole database of just being indexed. So as there is no single problem that I can talk about today, I wanted to go over all of the different problems that are behind indexing. So in general, indexing is more complex than just crawl budget. This is something that we need to start with straight away. And just quickly, definition of indexed simplified is basically if it's on Google, it's indexed. So that's behind us. And looking at all these big brands, this problem is bigger than we can think about sometimes. So if you look at Myntra or Victoria's Secret or Amway, Best Buy, like Victoria's Secret with 81% of their URLs indexable, unique URLs, not in Google's index, this is getting quite serious. So looking into these problems, we realized over the last few years of researching that indexing is way more complex than just JavaScript SEO, because indexing was connected to JavaScript quite often and crawler budget. And I quickly found 4 main kinds of indexing problems. So one of these being URL indexing, the simplest possible way. So if your URL is not in Google, then we have URL indexing problems. Second would be mobile first, related indexing problems. And then third one, JavaScript related indexing problems. So if something is not visible with JavaScript, it's switched off, it's JavaScript. And the last one, the most complex one and the most challenging one, is layout or quality-based indexing. And this has to go a lot of rendering and so on, but we'll get to those. So let's start with a very simple chart of how indexing works. So we basically start with discovery and the whole line, but there are 2 main moments when so each URL has to be crawled and rendered to get to being indexed or partially indexed. And over the next few years, indexing is going to be more and more of a problem. And this is not me looking into the future, but this is really becoming a challenge for Google and other search engines as well, where the internet is getting bigger and bigger, especially now with COVID and a lot of brands just jumping online to sell their products because of the lockdowns and so on. But also those technologies are getting more and more expensive to render and to process. So Google is becoming overwhelmed quickly. And this is something we can see. This is something that Google is starting to talk about openly. So if we look at tweets of, for example, Gary Ilch about Gary selection, index selection, I'll go over just a very quick crash course of what index selection is. Just 1 minute crash course here. So basically, index selection for dummies, we have a search engine and there is a queue. Google has limited resources, so when there is more storage or more resources available, they might index those less attractive URLs from the end of the line. But at the same time, if they don't have enough resources, they may ask you to leave to make room for better URLs. Oh, and there's just one more thing at the very end. You need to have good content, indexing strategy, links. You need to be crawled and rendered to even stand in this line. So this became very, very complex quickly, because now if we add up those 2 metrics, so limited resources from the search engine plus index selection, we have brand new challenges. So let's start with a little warm up and let's look into URL indexing. So let's start with a very simple example from Topshop. We have shoes, white shoes, and this URL is not indexed in Google. This is fairly simple. This is a very simple thing to diagnose, but we need to watch out for one thing, a lot of false negatives. So Google is kind of playing tricks on us with the side comment quite often. I would assume that you maybe saw that in the wild. And there is a very simple solution for now that works. Obviously, we can get into a whole different presentation or a whole session about how to avoid that. But just use any keyword that's showing up within the page, like a brand name or a part of text, and you can then make sure that this URL is really not indexed in Google. So this is a fairly good method so far of going over this problem with a site command. Moving forward, there are a few main causes of URL indexing, and again, this is the simplest possible problem. It's usually content quality, index bloat, or crawler budget issues. So this is the simplest possible indexing issue we can encounter, but now let's dive into a few more geeky, more complex ones. So partial indexing is something that I'm extremely passionate about because it's really a different beast with each website that you're going to look into. So if you're going to look into mobile first, this is very, very simple. If you have something visible on desktop and it's not visible on mobile, with mobile first indexing, Google won't index that. So this is very straightforward. Again, example from UX, we'll see that desktop site has a made in Italy part, but this part is not visible on mobile, and boom, Google didn't index that part of the content. This is very straightforward. And there are two ways of indexing, of diagnosing those indexing issues. So one simple way, something I usually do, is just a side-by-side visual comparison. So basically look at both versions. But if you really need to diagnose that for a client, or you're doing that in depth, or there's a lot of content, you can use diff checker. It's a little bit more complex. There's a desktop version of the tool, there's an online version, and basically see which part of the content are not visible on a mobile. Fairly straightforward. So make sure that everything that's visible on a desktop is visible on a mobile as well. This was also covered by Googlers a few times. So this is, again, fairly straightforward. So now let's move into JavaScript indexing. This is a little bit more geeky when it comes to fixing those problems, but it's fairly easy to diagnose if you have it. So if you think about this new shiny JavaScript frameworks that your developers are probably proposing to you all the time, make sure that you know about the costs that come with those frameworks. Because JavaScript indexing trends, they tend to go down over time, something we're watching over the last few years, that Google is indexing less and less of JavaScript content. So before we move forward, we need to address one thing with JavaScript websites. So if you remember those good old times when only some websites were JavaScript powered, those times are gone, just like Walkmans or Kodak film or floppy disks or PDAs, something I even struggled to find pictures of online. Because in 2020, WordPress, Magento, even Wix or Shopify are usually somehow JS powered as well. So you will have some of the content depending on JavaScript, even if you're on WordPress, something that again makes Googlebot and the web rendering service a little bit unhappy at times. And at some point, I had a conversation with John Meller in Zurich when I asked, okay, John, if Google is getting better with JavaScript, with rendering, so is JavaScript SEO dying in a way? And John said something that I didn't understood fully at the time. He mentioned that JavaScript is not dying, it's just getting more complex. So I translated that for all of us. So in simpler terms, JavaScript SEO is not dying, it's getting a little bit more fucked up, or even if we want to show that simpler, JavaScript SEO kind of leveled up over the last few years. So this is something we're going to struggle with. So JavaScript SEO moved towards JavaScript indexing and rendering. So we need to understand a few more things to fully diagnose JavaScript-powered websites. So let me show you a very simple example. So this is Topshop with and without JavaScript. And again, fairly straightforward. The URL is indexed, but the part of the content that relies on JavaScript, in this case, this whole part of the website, why not try? With JavaScript switched off, it disappears. So as you can imagine, this part is not indexed in Google. Again, very simple to diagnose, a little bit more complex to fix, but you can spot those problems fairly easy. The URL is indexed, JavaScript dependent content is not indexed. But now to understand in depth the JavaScript-related problems, we need to look under Google's hood a little bit and look into web rendering service. And Google mentioned, I think it was last year, 2 years ago, that at some point they will interrupt scripts. And we started to look into what that means actually, because then this is a very conflicting message from Google actually, when a lot of Googlers will tell you different things about how and when they will do that. So we looked at rendering from a search engine's perspective. We spent a few months with Tomek in Google's patents, and we figured out that there are two different ways of looking at the website. So one is how you see a website in your browser, and one is how Google is looking at your website through batch optimized rendering. And if we look at those two problems, so on the left-hand side, you will see H&M's page in your browser. On the right-hand side, you can see that Ask Google would look at that. And let me explain that step by step. It's going to be fairly straightforward, I hope. With step one, batch optimized renderings skips all of the resources that are not essential. So they will ignore Google Analytics, ads, and images, which is actually quite interesting, but we'll get into that. And if you look at that page, H&M's page, after removing all of those elements, and I usually move a little bit slower in Chrome DevTools, you will see that this page looks just like on the screenshot before. And what it does, it massively reduces the load needed to render the page. And you can see the scripting move down from 2000 milliseconds just to 700. So you can see that this saves quite a bit of resources for web rendering service. The second step, they will set the value on a virtual clock. I will explain virtual clock in a second, but they set the value on a virtual clock. That clock's time runs out and your layout is generated. And that's everything. But now let's dive into what just happened. So we have two most important metrics just to simplify this research. So we have a virtual clock and we have layout. And virtual clock is basically a form of rendering budget. And this is an extreme simplification. We don't want to dive into that too much, but virtual clock is just a rendering budget. Virtual clock looks at the cost of your website's rendering, and it's going to pause while waiting for scripts, when something times out, when waiting for a CSS file, it's not going to run. So that virtual clock only measures the time spent rendering your page. Hence, virtual clock, I guess. And the scripts and CSS heavy websites will need more time on that virtual clock. The problem is that they most likely they're not going to get it from Google. So now the most important thing happens, something that I find fascinating. So when the virtual clock's time runs out, your website's layout is generated, regardless of if it's finished or not. So we will find, so basically this slide is showing the reason for partial indexing that depends on JavaScript, or sometimes even CSS if you're gonna go really crazy on your styles. So that's where JavaScript SEO is gonna finish, or we're gonna enter rendering SEO. And let me give you a quick crash course into rendering SEO, something that we're talking about for a few months now. It's something that we're very passionate about. I believe that rendering in Google started around 2011. So before 2011, let's call these pre-layout times. And around 2011, according to Google's patents, Google started to render pages. And that's also quite interesting. That's where Google Panda was introduced and some of the content quality updates. So we can assume that Google started to render content around 2011. Again, this is our theory. This part wasn't confirmed by Googlers yet. So layout versus rendering, looking at these two new findings. So Google Patents have a lot of focus on layout. We're actually hoping to find more technical info in those documents, but we found that there is a huge pressure on layout. And we can see that content location matters, and these patents are not always around just rendering. There are sometimes about links, but we can see that everything that's above the fold is more important. That's one example. Or we can see that some sections of the page are going to be more important than others, and that goes in line with what I'm going to talk about indexing in a second. So we can see that JavaScript SEO and just seeing the content, something we're focused for the last few years, is way less complex than layout and different parts of the website and all these other problems that we're going to dive into in a second. Something we all know that some sections may get more link juice. This is actually an example from Google Patents, exact example. Yeah, sorry, it's late here. But anyhow, this is an example from Google Patent that more top stories at CNN.com will have higher probability of being selected. And this goes about links, but I believe that the same logic was used for content. Let me show you an example. So we have those database of million URLs that don't correlate with anything. So we see that parts of the page that are not indexed are very often those related items you may also be interested in, or customers who bought this item also bought, and you know the type of the page. Just to show you that in a whole view of the page, the main content is usually indexed, but in most cases, and it goes to like 80-90% of times it's not indexed, you will see that those similar items and the stuff that's below the main content's description is not indexed in Google. So going even more beyond JavaScript, this brings us to the fourth and the most geeky kind of partial indexing, and this is layout-based indexing issues. We can also call it sometimes quality-based, but it's we're still looking for a good name. So if you have something in mind, you can tweet it. We're open to suggestions. So this is a page from Target, and if you look at that, it looks straightforward. Like, okay, the URL is indexed. It's actually quite interesting to see that, because Target is also struggling with indexing. But if we dive deeper into the page, we can see that this whole section in the bottom is not indexed in Google. And we're going to get into a few more elements of that page that are struggling with indexing, but this goes more or less within that pattern we're seeing for most e-commerce stores, for most big brands out there. But it's going to get, so this is an example of that layout-based or quality-based indexing. We can assume that Google skipped this part because they didn't find it necessary enough to index. So it goes in line with what we're showing here, but if we look at all these partial indexing problems, they're not that serious until they all come together. So let's investigate that page from target.com again, and we'll find the whole something that excites me quite a bit, with all these four problems of all these four kinds of indexing problems within one page. And this happens for most of our clients. They struggle with all four problems somehow combined. So this page from target.com is struggling with URL indexing on a domain level, but then the middle part struggles with both JavaScript and mobile indexing problems, and the bottom of the page is struggling with indexing, most likely because of those quality problems. Let me show you that. Let me divide that into a few more slides. So if we look at URLs at the domain level, 87% of target.com is indexed in Google. So they have only 13% of URLs not indexed. This is fairly good. But if we look at the top of the product description, again, 87, so it's in line with URLs. But the product description itself, it goes down to 62. So we have 40% of product descriptions throughout the whole target.com that are not indexed. But moving lower into the page, if we look at the more to consider section, only 43% of those elements, in 43%, only this part of the page is indexed. So we see that this page in general is struggling with all these four kinds of indexing problems for four different reasons. So this combined effect is something that's actually driving those visibility problems, all those problems we're talking about. So to address indexing, just to go through that process step by step, we need to divide all these different problems. So we need to look on which elements depend on JavaScript. Maybe there are quality issues with URLs, index bloat, and so on. Maybe there is something going on with mobile first, and all these problems fixed, they can get your website indexed. And what's actually most important, let's talk about results of that. That's going to get you tremendous results. So if you address all those four problems at once, because it rarely happens that you only struggle with one. You will see very good rankings and you will see very good improvement. That's it. I think I did it quicker than I expected. I know we were a little bit behind time, so thank you so much. The link to this deck, as promised, is here, and don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thanks so much.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. Wow. That's really awesome. I think this applies to a lot of people. I don't know about everyone else out there, but I feel like right now is the time for site migrations, or just like iterations where they're like, you know what, there's this like really cool shiny thing that I want to implement on my site. And then you come to work the next day and you realize like, oh, okay, we're massively bleeding organic keyword rankings, and you realize that they've just pushed all of this JavaScript live, which they haven't consulted you about. Sorry, triggered, very, very triggered. We've got a whole bunch of really, really amazing questions, but Cindy, I think you wrote this question in, which I kind of would love to start with because it's, you know, it's happening right now in this space. So how do you think the announcement about passages and subtopics relates to indexing? I love that.
Sorry, is it for Cindy? I'm sorry, I'm still, it's for me. Oh,
No, it's for you, it's for you.
Yeah, sorry.
I heard passage indexing. I was like, this is Cindy's baby. But yeah, basically passage indexing, it's a little bit different than what we're talking about. So in general, passage indexing is not about partial indexing. It's just about taking a part of the content from the page and treating those as an entity, something that Cindy can do. Cindy, help me out here. This is your topic.
Well, it was my question.
Oh, that was your question.
To get your idea.
So in general, your question doesn't go into what I was talking about, like at all. This is a whole other, I think, part of the problem, maybe not problem, algorithm.
But perhaps, so I wonder though, Google being able to understand the different parts of the page and ignore parts and stuff like that, that probably is relevant for passage indexing, right? Because we can say we're not going to take passages from the related items or the sidebars, and maybe chunking Google's ability to understand the pieces of the page might be more sophisticated than what you had diagrams. Maybe it can chunk it in even smaller pieces. That's kind of where I was coming
makes
from.
Sorry, I'm still in the presentation mode, but yeah, in my head. But that makes sense. I think that Google is really, and this is something that Martin Splitt said in our webinar, that they can understand parts of the page fairly well, so they can rank it just because an element with it. So again, passage indexing. So this is something that was said, I think, half a year ago or so, a few times, that they're getting very, very good at dividing. Okay, this is a website about bikes, but this element of the page is about motorbikes or whatever. So this is not that relevant. So we can either skip indexing that, or we can assume that with passage indexing, they may rank it for a whole other group of keywords, something like that, I would assume.
Well, and Google's talking about with the subtopics, they're talking about creating subtopics within a search result. So maybe that means that long pages can find not just the passages, but also chunks by subtopic. You know what I mean? To say this is relevant and this is relevant.
I can imagine that. We're mostly focused on the stuff that Google is not indexing, so we didn't actually stop to think about what they are indexing. So this is I know this is in line with your Fraggle theory quite a bit. That's why I was assuming this question goes to Cindy. But yeah.
Can I have a follow-up, Nick? It's totally, actually, it's a different question, but I have a question that I want to make sure to get in. Is how, Bartosz, how are you getting those stats on Target, which is such a big site, to know that 60 blah, blah, blah % of pages are missing the related items? Is that an internal tool that you use?
So what we do, and this is gonna sound bad, but we scrape sitemaps of big websites. So that's why we don't have Amazon. They are very, very secret about their sitemaps. We wished we have like Amazon sitemap. I'm gonna pay you $1,000 to see their indexing stats. But anyhow, we're scraping sitemaps. We're then looking into which URLs are indexable because people put a lot of junk in their sitemaps actually. So we analyze their sitemaps. We filter out all of the not indexable content. And then we run that day by day. So we see, okay, this URL was published, let's say today. So we're going to check if it's indexed today, then after 7 days and after 14 days. And we'll see how that goes in time. So that's URL indexing. But then we kicked out into this topic quite a bit. And then we started to look into the parts of the page quite a bit. So for example, with Target, we looked into all the sections that we could put into our software. So if there is something that's like related items or product description, if we can somehow tag it, we do that. So then our bots go into the page, see if that content is within the page, and then we see if that part of the page is indexed. Hence all the proxies and CAPTCHAs and all these other problems. But we do that on a massive scale now. We're really hoping that Google is not going to ban all our proxies at some point. But we this is so exciting. We didn't even publish all of our research, but we get to see so many different problems, and now we have a massive research about sitemap and hreflangs that Google is somehow starts to ignore them. Hence a lot of the indexing problems for big brands recently. But yeah, I can go on and on. Sorry.
Very glad somebody's doing this research.
Awesome.
Quite glad it's you, Bartosz. Not me.
Oh, absolutely. I'm like, ooh, watch this space because I can't wait to when that comes out.
Oh, please don't. Please don't. I wouldn't worry about a lot of SEO, but not you, Will.
All right, let's go into user questions. So we've had lots of really, really great questions come through. This one's from Pragyanshu Lab. You've asked a couple of questions, but I think this one's really good. In Google Search Console coverage, 70 to 80% of pages are under excluded. How do you make them valid? Categories are not parked in discovered, currently not indexed, and crawled, currently not indexed. So what would you do there? I'll put it to the group, and whoever wants to jump in, jump in.
Can you show the question again? Sorry. I can jump in unless I want to give them
Go in.
So
Go in.
What I would assume that you should also see, as far as I remember this, you should see different reasons underneath this tab. So you can see like Google shows different canonical or whatever from the top of my head. But in general, I would look into these excluded URLs and analyze them. So if you see, sorry, Nick, can you see that 70-80% are under excluded? I'm looking to the YouTube delayed YouTube stream to read that. So if they were crawled but not indexed, what I would do is look under different reasons listed in Search Console underneath that report. But then the second thing I would do is just crawl the whole website with like write or something that's going to analyze if there are duplicates. Maybe there are some other problems. I wouldn't assume that this is a technical problem. I would rather assume that in this case, this would be a quality issue, something in this ballpark. 70-80% is really bad, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
They make content too. And what I've seen is you can export from GSC just the lists that are in that 70-80% and then put that through the crawler as a list.
You can
also with bearing in mind, sorry, Bob.
Yeah, you can always find Tomek. I mentioned in the presentation, Tomek Rudzki on Twitter, and just send it over to him. He loves this. Like, this is his hobby.
His guilty pleasure.
He's gonna look into that and he's gonna love it. But yeah,
I would say it's very much worth bearing in mind that the objective here may not be to get those pages included. You may find that the better option is actually to not have those pages, at least some of them. This could be a site that has too many pages for its authority. These pages are too similar to one another, just low quality and not valuable to the users. So I wouldn't rule out the idea that actually you should be kind of truncating some of this site.
I don't want to offend anyone, but with 70-80%, I would be shocked to find that this is all amazing content. So that's what we also.
I'm not taking the other side of that bit.
what Will said in a Polish accent. So you know.
Brilliant. Right. Our next question comes from Kevin Moore. How does a headless CMS such as Cockpit fare out for SEO? Has anyone here worked with Cockpit? Anyone got any good, bad experiences?
So others may be able to speak specifically to the specifics of Cockpit, but I think fundamentally there's nothing about a headless CMS that would make any difference. Right, from my technical understanding of how that would all hang together, there's nothing fundamental that would mean, depending how the CMS is put together, you could build different front ends. And in fact, that's kind of the fundamental point of headless, right? Is you can build many different presentations of the data. And so it could rely on JavaScript, it could not rely on JavaScript, it could be fast, it could be slow. I guess it won't change the quality of your content.
What Will said, just by the definition of headless, I'm not seeing like a technical problem with that, unless you build something really bad on the front end.
Pre-render everything, right, Bartosz? Make sure everything's pre-rendered and executed server-side rather than client-side if you can.
Emphatic nodding.
There could be hundreds possible scenarios, but I would probably go with what Cindy said.
One, like you would create a default one for the bot.
So I would make sure what Cindy said, that this is server-side rendered, would be my number one step.
Yeah, definitely. Go to the source code webpage, see the fetch contents. If it's server-side rendered, you'll only see in the HTML boilerplate than if it's client-side rendered.
Correct. You're muted, Nick.
Oh, that's fantastic. Awesome. No one heard anything.
We are all guilty of that sometimes.
Oh, man. Absolutely. This next question comes from Dan Saunders. What are the key red flags we look for when I think your presentation already did a great job, but maybe just like a little wrap up.
So in most cases, just pardon my French, just shit content and just poor indexing strategy. So if you don't have like something I didn't say in the presentation, so information architecture would be number one, indexing strategy, all the faceted navigation problems. Like I would go with, again, full crawl. See, like if you have 100 products, but then you have 10,000 URLs, I would start to worry and look into that first. Like this is a general question. Sorry, I cannot go with anything better. It depends.
No.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely. It feels like a lot of these are their symptoms, right? So as Bartosz just said, like the indexing, it's not like you do indexing wrong on your website. You can do many different things wrong that can result in indexing problems. So I guess if we're interpreting this question as this is about red flags, so I guess it's how do you know if you have indexing problems? And I think you start with I think there's two directions to come at this from. There's kind of how confident are you in the quality of your content, the information architecture, all the fundamentals that Bartosz mentioned. So you're less likely to have these problems if your website is very well set up, great content, sensible URLs, it gets crawled well, etc. I think literally the red flag. So I guess there's crawling issues would be a red flag. So any kind of like the question we had before, issues in Search Console or the like. Changes in this can underpin a lot of changes in performance, right? So if you think about kind of Google's assessment of content quality, that evolves with things like core updates and the like. So if you're seeing changes around those times, it's an area you can dig into a little bit more. I would say probably what you'll find is it'll be a spot check that turns this up, right? Somebody will discover that a key page isn't indexed. Or maybe not a key page, it's unlikely to be the homepage or whatever, but you like the Topshop, was a Topshop example that you pulled up, Bartosz used. Somebody will send you a link and say, hey, why isn't this page indexed? So somebody will notice it somewhere. I think more systematically, you could use the tools like the ones Bartosz is talking about to kind of do it at a bigger scale.
Just long story short with that, I would just spend hours and hours in Search Console and coverage report and just look into all the data you can find in there.
Yeah. Everything you've automated, it is possible to do by hand, right? It's just computers do it faster. So get a cup of coffee and do some spot checks.
I think awesome. So I'll ask the next question. Tiago Calvez asks, what can we do to have the sections at the bottom of the pages to be indexed? That question flew up really, really quickly, but maybe this is pertain to with your fantastic tool at Onely. What would JavaScript do? And you can't see like the bit actually index.
So basically, Tiago, I would just make sure that they don't depend on JavaScript. Apart from that, we're mostly looking to the problem. We don't really know clearly what's causing that. What Martin Schlitt said openly, that if you have a product page of, let's say that you have an iPhone product page, and then you're showing like you may also be interested in Samsung, Google will skip that because they see that this is not clearly within the same intent. Let's call it that. So I would make sure that everything in the bottom of the page relates clearly to the top of the page. And if Google will index that if there is value behind that. So if these are like similar items, I wouldn't index that as Google. Like, why would I?
Well, and Bartosz, when you say it's not getting indexed, that piece might not be indexed to the page, but Google could still be crawling those links. Is that right?
Exactly. So I don't see why, in every single example I was presenting, I don't see why I would index the bottom of the page when I was showing, I don't know, like chess thingy, whatever you call that board, chessboard, and then in the bottom of the page you have like lawn mowers. So like, what's the relation to that? Like, why would Google index it? But make sure, like in most of these cases, they somehow relate on, somehow depend on JavaScript as well. So I wouldn't serve these with client-side rendering.
Yeah, so it's about trying to avoid the situation where they've been rendered after the cutoff, or for whatever reason aren't even getting seen, because then the links might not be counted silly, right? So if you're if they're pulled in with JavaScript but they're pulled in too slowly, they may just not be visible at all. So you definitely want to spot that problem. But yeah, like you're right, you don't want to have your chessboard page rank for lawnmowers just because it happens to recommend it in your related product. It's not a very related product. But I have one question that I'm kind of curious about in here that I don't know if either of you have any experience of. Is Bartosz, I guess it might come up in your big data, but we know that they're futzing with the site command, right? The site command used to be super reliable back in the day.
Yeah,
right.
Like
as in
back in the day.
Yeah, I'm old. I'm really old, Bartosz, and so back in the day, you could just
with that skin.
Site command was always reliable.
Like 1925. Okay.
Yeah, like steam powered Google. So, but if we're saying now that they're well, we've all seen, right, that it's not reliable if you just do site : individual URL to see if that one page is indexed. How sure are we that they're not futzing with it in other ways? So do we know that it's reliable to use the quoted snippet like you showed? Have you seen cases where a page can rank without the site : and then disappears with the site : for example?
So far we didn't. But I'm pretty sure that this is going to happen sooner than later, because they
just for you at least, right? They're going to put in a if Bartosz flag.
Please don't jinx it. Like, shut up. But they're watching anyhow. I'm pretty sure that they will get rid of the site comment with the number of pages within the domain, because they announced it, I think, recently, right?
I mean, it's already, I think, randomized and a bit obfuscated anyway, right?
Yeah, it's still not something I would rely on, but sooner or later they will kill it, and all of our research is gonna be gone. But yeah, for now, with the extra words before site comment, it's 100%. It works very well for us. The problem is that they make it very difficult to scrape them, which I don't blame them for. But yeah, so far it works.
And one thing I'm not sure if you guys have seen, I'm guessing you have, but if a page is canonicalized to another page, even if the old page is old or something like that, Google can mess. Am I telling a secret you don't want me to tell, Bartosz?
No. Just I know what you're referring to. This is a massive pain in the. But yeah, continue. Sorry.
Pain in the butt. That they might show what it's canonicalized to, or they might show what it originally was. If there's 302s or 301s, they'll show the oldest one.
This is very painful in the Search Console. This is like the canonicalized.
They show that they care about history, because they're like, we knew about this back in when we were in power.
We all know about recent tweet from John Meller that 301 is not the strongest signal for canonicalization, and this is a whole discussion of if we should have Google changing canonicals to URLs that don't return code 200. Something I will never comprehend, because why would you have canonical to a URL that's 301? That's, why would you choose a canonical that don't exist? Regardless of the books they're pointing me towards, this is not logical. But yeah, let's keep this topic. Let's move forward.
Absolutely. All right. Well, the next question comes from Robin Adamita. Do you think the defer meta attribute instead of the async will reduce the JavaScript loading issues, and Mantra and other websites will be more open to being indexable?
So Mantra is a very unique website with the SEO part when they have like. Okay, so Mantra is loading everything with client-side rendering, as far as I checked the last time. And then they have the SEO box in SEO div in code, where they put all of the content below the CSR just for Google. So they have like very unique approach to serve content. So there is part of HTML below the real content describing what's in the CSR above. So in general, I don't think it's going to fix the problem. I would assume that for Mantra in this case and other websites, just showing client-side server-side rendered content, so basically HTML, is gonna be the solution. So if your scale is this big as Mantra, so it's one of the biggest e-commerce stores in India, I think, I wouldn't go ever with client-side rendering. So with JavaScript content facing clients.
Yeah.
And if Google is gonna like avoid those files, defer could help, but this is another patch to something that's broken.
Well, and another patch would be, it sounds to me like they're doing it in the wrong order. I would put the HTML above the CSR. Sorry, if you're going to patch things.
This is not nice to Mantra. I'm sure they're struggling with that internally for quite a bit. So I don't envy their SEO team having to work with that. So there's a lot of code depth they need to pay every day. So no, I don't want to shame them in any way. Just
awesome. You can always check the XHR responses in DevTools. You can actually see the actual data in response. Awesome. I'll move on to the next question. This one's again for you, Bartosz. I might just say Bart. I'm sorry. I'm blaming my Australianism. How did you get the whole cache data to decide whether that part was indexed or not for such big domains?
So we didn't check all of the URLs, unfortunately. So we work on samples of a few thousand URLs per domain. Sometimes if we really want to dive deeper into like websites like Target, we worked with few of our clients, like huge e-commerce stores, then we go with few like 10,000, sometimes more URLs. But this is this takes a lot of time, but we also are somehow limited to scraping sitemaps and new content. So we can only look at the new content. So even if the website is like 50 million pages, then they don't upload like 100,000 products per day. So we have to look at only new URLs to get the data of how long does it take for that URL to be indexed. So we look at samples, unfortunately. But with some of those, with actually a lot of those, we have Search Console access to our clients' data, and then we compare those. We actually have few articles coming about that.
Awesome. All right, I'll move on to the next question. I'm just going to skip down a few, if that's all right, guys. But Andy Beard asks, is there any points at all these days to use CSS to put top navigation below the main content in the source code? Oh, just put that out to anyone here on the panel.
Maybe. So we tested a not exactly this, but a variation of this in so at SearchPilot. What we're doing is running big SEO A/B tests all the time. And if you, I think you can read the case study. I think we published it recently. So if you go to searchpilot.com, case studies is in our top nav, ironically, and you can check it out. I think it's called something to do with restructuring HTML. And we did see we saw an uplift from only changing HTML ordering. There was no other change to the content. There was no other change to the site, except to shift things around. Now, it wasn't top nav that we tested, so I'd say your mileage may vary. You'll need to test that yourself. But in principle, yes, it's possible. And
Can you say what you changed?
So and I think I have the thing here. So it was to do with, I think it was we moved the sidebar, if I remember correctly. And where are we? Yeah, so the it was a coupon aggregator, and so there was a ton of information in the sidebar that was to do with the so for a given website. So an individual affiliate has pages on this site, right? And so the sidebar contains a lot of information about the website and very little information about the coupons. And obviously the intent is about coupons. And so the coupon content was all in the main body copy. So by moving the key intent up the HTML, that was essentially, so you can think less about what we moved down, more about what we moved up was the key piece that satisfied the core intent of that page, putting that as close to the top of the HTML as possible. I don't think that should work. Like I don't think that should make any difference. But we saw that in a split test. So I certainly wouldn't say for sure that moving your navigation around wouldn't work. I don't think it's a high ROI activity for anything but a kind of like peak optimized site.
Yeah, awesome.
Thank you, Will. I would have no idea how to answer that.
Well,
yeah, that's awesome testing. The next question comes from Haley Berginger. How do you think AMP is impacting mobile first indexing? Do you recommend making all sites AMP? I'd go with this and plug SearchPilot and A/B tests here.
Yes, we have done some testing on this. I'm interested more on the pure kind of AMP side, like the theory side. I'll defer to the others a little bit, but we are testing some of this stuff. I think for the most part, we've seen relatively. I need to check. We'll probably tweet something from SearchPilot to confirm what we have or haven't seen here. My understanding is that we've seen user metrics improve, but I don't think we've particularly seen major ranking benefits from.
So that's something that's something that we were briefly chatting about with Tom from SearchPilot as well. So something we wanted to test with Will, with Tom from SearchPilot. So basically, I would assume that it might impact indexing in a way, but this is something where A/B tests or something like that would work fairly well.
We have an active, we have a customer who's actively running tests in this area. I just haven't seen the results of them yet. So we'll tweet some updates on this, I'm sure.
And if I had to guess, I would say that an AMP page is not going to have as much skipped content, and it's not going to have that render clock problem. So you're going to probably get a more comprehensive crawling and indexing of your text content. There's just less risk there.
Though you are creating more pages as well, aren't you? So there's got to be more crawling going on, and there's canonicalizing going on, and I don't know exactly how much all of that there's a bit of magic, because when you canonicalize that, that's not a normal canonical, right? Like Google is not canonical. Google is sometimes choosing to display the AMP page. That's the entire point of the AMP page, even though you have it canonicalized to the regular HTML. So there's definitely some complexities. I'd love to, I think we could probably have a whole our speculating.
So why we basically wanted to play with that idea is looking at Google. They run a lot of heuristics for like both code and sitemaps and everything like that. So I would assume that with AMP, this would be much easier for them. So that may somehow help, even though that you have more URLs with AMP that you would have.
It's certainly possible. Yeah.
So
it's also going to be super muddied. Yeah. Like I said, we can speculate a ton on this.
One more speculation is that if you're testing on a slow phone with an imperfect connection, few bars, they may switch in the AMP more aggressively.
Yep.
Oh, wow. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to ask this last question because we've just got 5 minutes before Rick's presentation. But Hanya Petrovska asks, what is your opinion on AI-powered search platforms for internal search or category pages or facets which rely entirely on JavaScript?
That was a deep sigh.
That's Cindy.
Well, I mean, okay, so number one, Jess Schultz, who was on the previous session, has amazing thoughts and presentations on AI-powered search platforms and how to get these things indexed and how to prevent bad indexing of some pages and over-indexing and stuff like that. So I would research what she's written and presented about that, number one. Number two, faceted navigation is tough. And do a good job with your sitemaps. What, Bartosz, you must know, or Will, about the best, newest stuff to do for faceted navigation? There's a lot of old strategies, but is there something new?
I mean, I would certainly say we need to break this question down into the three pieces. So there's a question about facets and category pages. There's a question about whether they're generated with artificial intelligence, and there's a question about JavaScript. And I think each of those is somewhat independent. So I think, like, taking quickly, that my view is whether you use artificial intelligence to generate them or not, neither here nor there. Like, it depends whether they're good. Like, you can make good ones or bad ones with artificial intelligence. And so I think that's kind of independent. I think, yeah, what you were saying, Cindy, like the category pages and facets can be complicated to get right. I don't have super up-to-date data. I know that, again, there's a bunch of stuff we're running tests on to test different canonicalization levels or like which facets exist and don't, but I don't have perfect data for you on that right now. And for the JavaScript, over to you, but I think I know what you're going to say. Where are you?
So that's the only question from somebody from Poland, and I'm struggling to fully understand that. So that's very embarrassing. Sorry, I'm very sorry, Hania, for that. But yeah, I would. We have someone in the team who's actually more of an expert in that area than myself. I wouldn't tackle this question today.
With the faceted navigation, the older advice is to make sure you still have static URLs. And to not dynamically build the URLs. And if you are dynamically building the URLs and you can't help it, then to canonicalize to a single path to a product instead of, and canonicalize that breadcrumb navigation as well. So that even if people get to your end level conversion page in a creative way, you are sending the bots in a consistent way.
Yeah. It's I actually recently had to implement that on a really large e-commerce website where just exactly what you were saying with faceted navigation, it was dynamically creating all these filter generated URLs which are all being indexed. So we had the crawl look at 5.4 million URLs. So yeah, we use like essentially kind of like a regex canonical and pointed it back to like the root URLs. That is
Yeah, with this question, I only just froze on if the whole faceted navigation is generated with JavaScript, it would probably be on-click events or something like that, so it shouldn't be crawled. So I actually completely stopped here because if it's JavaScript, it shouldn't be clickable by Googlebot. So
I think there's two different ways. I think we're going to run out of time, but I could imagine versions of this that are generated with JavaScript that could be indexable. But I think our general, or I think probably all of us would say, if you can, get it server-side rendered, right? Like even if you're going to generate this stuff with artificial intelligence and JavaScript, render it and put it in your HTML.
What I can offer, Hania, just after this, feel free to just email me the website or the case. We're happy to look into that and give you something a little bit more clear than what I'm trying to.
That's all right.
So yeah, thank you.
Guys, we're going to have to finish up there. And I think it's a really great place to finish. Thank you so much, Bart. Thank you so much, Will and Cindy, for all of your expertise. Guys, go and find them later. I think we need to move very quickly on to the next presentation. But thank you so much for your time.